Today we're going to talk about the case of 21-year-old Travion, aka Trey Reed. He's a 21-year-old black student who is now going viral because of his death. He was found hanging from a tree at Delta State University. Now, law enforcement in the coroner's office say that this was a suicide. That's what they've ruled it. But the internet says he's a black man who was lynched. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, you better. Yeah, you better.
Guys, before we get into today's video, please like, subscribe, and maybe share this with anybody who's talking about this Trey Reed story, as we are going to get into the facts of this matter. As I said, he's a 21-year-old black student who was found hanging at Delta State University. Now, the internet is running with the idea that he was lynched, that this was an act of racial animosity and a hate crime, racial violence. I'm going to show you a TikTok, and then we'll sort of break down what's taken place here. This has over 800,000 likes.
I know half of y'all don't care, and I know half of you guys will not even repost this, but this is serious and we need to demand justice. Let's talk about Trey Reed, because his story cannot and will not get swept under the rug. 21-year-old Trey Reed, a black student at Delta State University, was found hanging from a tree on campus early Monday morning. He was discovered near pickleball courts around 7 a.m., and the university canceled classes and even their centennial celebration because of the shock. But like always, the police always say they don't suspect foul play.
Do the police always say they don't suspect foul play? Are police rushing to come to that conclusion, especially in our year 2025, where we're having deep conversations about race and politics and intersectionality? Do we think that police would rush to label something as without foul play? I don't know. It's a really big assumption.
Let's be real. When a young black man is found hanging from a tree in Mississippi, you do not just brush that off. You investigate every inch of that scene, because our history in this country makes it impossible to just ignore it.
Okay. Another assumption here. Did they rush through an investigation here? Is there any evidence to substantiate that claim? Because I haven't read anything that says that. Did they do a full-scale investigation, or did they rush through and say, oh, without foul play, because we have a history of lynching in this state? Now, I can understand with America's history, with the history in Mississippi, which we'll get into in just a moment, how one could see imagery like this, a gruesome death like this, and think maybe it's possible that foul play is involved and somebody murdered or lynched this young guy. And I can imagine that that may have occurred to law enforcement, and that they would do their due diligence to figure out what actually took place before they label something as without foul play. I imagine. I mean, we'll find out, I guess.
On social media, people are demanding answers. Some are claiming Trey Reed had injuries like a broken arm and bruises, raising even more suspicion. The family asked the public to not share any graphic images, but they also want transparency, and they deserve the truth. And let's be clear. Black people do not hang themselves from trees. That image is not neutral. It's rooted in America's history of racial violence and lynching.
Okay, pause there. So we're hearing claims that there were other injuries to his body, which should, of course, be investigated. But where are these claims coming from? She just says people on the internet are saying this. Now, she goes on to say that black people just don't hang themselves from trees, which I guess she's just saying that black people are a monolith and they've just decided across the board that that's just something they don't do. That's not evidence. That's not part of an actual supported claim. You're just speaking at that point. Black people are totally capable of doing something like this or not doing something like this. So this is not evidence. This is not something to really bring about suspicion in this case. The only thing that should bring about suspicion is any evidence that this guy was actually physically harmed or lynched. And if that did happen, of course, people would be up in arms. If this guy was lynched and we find out that's what happened, that is a horrific act of racial violence, of political violence, and it most definitely should be spoken about. And the person who did something like that should have the book thrown at them. But again, we have no evidence. It's just that people feel as though it could be this because of imagery that's popping up in their head, which is not right.
For generations, that was the tool to terrorize the black community. So when law enforcement rushes to say no foul play, it raises red flags. Trey Reed's life mattered. He was 21 years old and he had a future, and he deserves a full investigation, not a quick dismissal. We cannot let this become another case that fades into silence.
Okay. I mean, I just don't know where she's getting these ideas from. And she's making some really, really big assumptions on the basis of these ideas that she has not substantiated whatsoever. Now, other people are posting online. This person says the two men that were lynched in Mississippi last week, one for the crime, in quotes, of being black, and one for the crime of being homeless, and she puts Trey Reed in that. It has 196,000 likes on it, 3.8 million views. Don Lemon also decided to make a video about this case, again, with no evidence whatsoever, other than the idea that the imagery evokes the idea of racial violence. Let's watch his video.
A 21-year-old student was found hanging from a tree in Cleveland, Mississippi. It's at a university called Delta State University in Cleveland. They found him early in the morning, about 7 o'clock, hanging from a tree. They're saying at this point there's no foul play, but folks are calling for investigations. And I think they need to get to the bottom. This guy's name is DeMar Travion Trey Reed. He's from Grenada, Mississippi. Everyone they spoke to said he was a great guy. He lit up a room. And so why was he hanging from a tree?
Oh my God.
What happened? That's what we need to know, whether it's foul play or not. This story deserves to be investigated and told, and we'll
Again, where is the idea that this wasn't investigated coming from? It's so interesting that I guess people just see the imagery and they think this must be an act of racism. So they're not calling for a full-scale investigation. They're calling for a second investigation. Let's be honest here, because law enforcement already investigated, an autopsy was already done, and that's the conclusion that they came to. And I'm going to read a little bit about that just so we all know the facts here. And again, if Trey Reed was lynched, of course we need to talk about that, and of course we need to go after the person who did it. But again, there's no evidence. So here's an article out of Newsweek. It says an autopsy of DeMar Travion Trey Reed by Mississippi State Medical Examiner concluded that his death was a suicide, and this was restated by the police department. Now, while officials say that there's no evidence of foul play, the case has drawn widespread attention, skepticism, and calls for transparency. Why? The article goes on to say it evoked Mississippi's history of racial violence, particularly during the Jim Crow era, which of course during Jim Crow there was racial violence, there were lynchings, most famously the 1955 lynching of Emmett Till, which many of us know about. If you don't, he was a 14-year-old boy who was accused by a white woman of flirting with her, making lewd comments, being offensive towards her, and he ended up being lynched by two men who admitted to lynching him, and it was a brutal lynching. He was abducted, he was tortured, and once the family had his body returned to them, they did an open casket funeral, which you can actually look up and see the brutality of what took place with Emmett Till. Now, to immediately associate that to Trey Reed's death, of course, it makes sense to naturally think that based on the imagery, but we cannot just go off making these baseless assumptions because we can reference historical imagery that reminds us of what we're seeing today. Now, the article goes on to say, on Thursday, the Cleveland Police Department released a statement saying an autopsy performed on Reed's body at the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's office was, quote, consistent with the initial investigation, determining the cause of death to be hanging and the manner of death as suicide. The department is still waiting on a final toxicology report, and that will come off later, but the case has been handed over to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office for further review. Now, it goes on to say a preliminary examination conducted by Boulevard County Coroner Randolph Sears Jr. had earlier concluded Reed, quote, did not suffer any lacerations, contusions, compound fractures, broken bones, or injuries consistent with an assault. And on Wednesday at a press conference, this is the real kicker, authorities said there was video footage showing the events leading up to Reed's death, which took place on Sunday. So they're claiming they literally have video footage of Trey Reed committing suicide, yet the internet is running with this lynching narrative. And because the internet is running with this narrative, other people are sort of hopping in to assert themselves and be a part of this new investigation that is apparently happening. Colin Kaepernick, who we know is a race baiter to end all race baiters, says that he's going to fund a second autopsy for the Delta State student found hanging from a tree. So even though they have this video evidence, they have the autopsy report, they have law enforcement's investigation into this, or the initial investigation, Colin Kaepernick is now funding a second autopsy, which by all means, and again, if the second autopsy finds any evidence of a lynching or any sort of defensive wounds that could have occurred during an attack or something of that matter, then by all means talk about it. But where are we getting this claim from other than people who are baselessly sharing it on the internet? And in a time where we're having very deep discussions about political violence, we've just seen what's happened with Charlie Kirk. We just saw the shooting at one of the ABC offices over everything that took place with Jimmy Kimmel. Now we're talking about a lynching and saying that this is racially motivated, which we know what that insinuates and what that is directly telling us to think and feel when we don't have any evidence for that claim. And another facet of this is that you're taking somebody who was apparently experiencing deep despair and depression. There's really no other way to put it if they decided to take their own life, and you're making it about politics and you're spinning a racial narrative with his name. Oftentimes we find with situations like this, the demand for racism far outweighs the supply, and we're willing to point at a bunch of things and label them as racist, white supremacist, white nationalist, as we do these days, when in reality, it's not the case. It's not what's happening. And shouldn't we rejoice? Shouldn't we be so profoundly happy? It seems this was a suicide, which is horrible and terrifying. And I can imagine the state of mind one must be in to commit an act like that. But if you're going to call this a lynching and then you find out that it's not, would you not be relieved that this in fact wasn't a lynching that sort of brings up the racial past of Mississippi? Shouldn't you take a beat and a sigh of relief knowing that that's not what happened, even though the story is still sad on its own? But you're not actually able to sit in or feel the sadness of what's taken place in this young man's life if the narrative that's being spun is a falsified one. We are actually just continuing to sow the seeds of racial animosity and racial division by doing this with stories. And again, we should be so relieved to find out that through investigation, this was in fact a suicide and not a lynching. And I know it's sort of picking the lesser of two obviously horrible things, but nonetheless, the idea that there would be still people out there who would have lynched a black man on a university campus would be insane. But law enforcement and the coroner's office is telling you that's not the case. So take a beat. So now a bunch of people on the internet are all worked up thinking that not only did this deeply racist thing take place where a man's life was taken, but it's been swept under the rug by a system that apparently doesn't want to talk about that. Make it make sense. So I felt the need to clear up this case, or at least what we know so far about this case on the channel today. And if more comes out and we start to see this in a different light or from a different perspective, we will update that on this very channel. But so far, we don't have that information. So to be race baiting off of a suicide is insane. To be pushing this idea of racial animosity and racial tension where there's a case where there simply was none is insane. So please, guys, let's breathe and not share falsehoods about this. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments down below. Let me know what you think. As always, if you disagree with anything I said in this video, do get out, but do so respectfully. I encourage healthy debate on this channel. Yeah, just let me know how you feel about this and if you've heard this story. I'm not going to ask for the liking and the notification bell because it kind of feels weird. Okay, bye guys.
Yeah, you better. Yeah, you better.